Okay, a couple of weeks ago, I did something that shocked my friends and family. I actually read a book. Not a financial statement report, not a printout of a stack of emails, not an industry magazine, but an actual book with a hard cover and nice pages. It's actually quite an enjoyable experience. I suggest you all try it sometime. This is the book I read. It's entitled The Power Surge by Dr. Michael Levy. And I've had the pleasure of reading a number of pieces about the energy policy debate. And so what I found inside this book was a real surprise. Admittedly, I'd expected to find cleverly worded, one-sided propaganda that's the hallmark of any debate in our soundbite-driven news cycle. But instead, I found nuance and the understanding of complexity. I expected to find attacks and hand-picked anecdotes trying to prove the correctness of one side of the argument at the expense of another. Instead, I found an appreciation that both sides of an argument can have validity. And nowhere, not in one place in this book, did I detect any type of hidden agenda. I didn't see any cause except to identify what the true nature of the problem is and propose a workable solution. In the world of any highly politically charged debate, I think you'll agree this is exceedingly rare. And I applaud his approach, and I look forward to what he has to say to us today. Dr. Michael Levy is the David M. Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment on the Council of Foreign Relations and the Director of the Council's Program on Energy Security and Climate Change. He's an expert on climate change, energy security, arms control, and nuclear terrorism. He's project director for the Council of Foreign Relations-sponsored Independent Task Force on Climate Change, co-chairs by former governors Tom Vilsack and George Pataki. His essays have been published in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Nature, Scientific American, among others. His op-eds have appeared in New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and his book is even reviewed in this week's Economist. Perhaps most interesting to some of you, he served as a technical consultant to the critically acclaimed drama 24. Well, we could probably spend an hour asking him questions about that, actually. He holds a BS in mathematical physics, an MA in physics, and a PhD in war studies. So let's not hold it against him that he currently lives in New York City. Please join me in offering a very warm welcome to our distinguished speaker, Michael Levy.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. It's fantastic to see such a big crowd here. Apparently there's some folks in Houston who are interested in energy. I was telling someone earlier I had difficulty choosing exactly what to wear today. While I was writing this book, I picked up some interesting items of clothing. I have now a 50th anniversary OPEC tie that I still can't find occasion to wear. I have a beautiful light blue Don't Frack Ohio bandana that I also decided against wearing in Houston. At some point, I'll try to wear them, maybe not at the same time, but I'll find some occasion. I want you all to imagine for a moment that this is June 1973, not June 2013. It's been a little more than 2 years since U.S. oil production peaked, and you're starting to see gas lines pop up around the country as regulators try to ration supplies. It's been barely 3 years since the first Earth Day marked the beginning of the modern environmental movement. And even though most of you probably aren't thinking about the Middle East, you will be in a few months when a group of Arab oil producers quadruple their prices and set off the 1973 oil crisis. In the next few years, you'll see the United States start to respond. Part of that will come from markets. Higher prices spur new supplies, encourage people to curb demand, and persuade innovators to invest in new technologies. Another part of it comes from policy. Barely a month after the crisis begins, Congress moves forward on a long-stalled oil pipeline across Alaska. And within a couple of years, it passes the first ever fuel economy standards requiring more efficient cars and trucks. But if you look a few more years into the future, you'll find the country consumed by paralyzing battles. One camp is focused on growing supplies of traditional fuels, oil, coal, natural gas, and increasingly nuclear power. Another is focused on alternatives and on promoting conservation and efficiency. And the one thing that the two largely agree on is that the country now has to choose. Energy becomes a focal point in the years that come and peaks in the 1980 election. It becomes so intensely enmeshed in ideological battles that it's pretty much impossible to focus on the underlying substance. I did a lot of my historical research for this book in the early days of the last presidential election campaign, and the parallels were eerie. If you look at the 1980 campaign, Ted Kennedy is the left-wing standard-bearer in the Democratic primary. He describes his opponent's energy platform as creating a scale of unequal sacrifice based on unfair prices that would bring hardship to ordinary people. David Stockman, who is less remembered as the chief architect of Ronald Reagan's energy plan that year, calls Jimmy Carter's plan a front for state control of resources in the economy, and describes its proponents as prosecuting their views with a determination befitting the smallness of their minds. It shouldn't be a surprise that with energy turned into such a prominent ideological battlefield, while the United States makes some progress, the result is mostly gridlock. By the end of the 1980s, oil production has plummeted, access to new resources is becoming more difficult, Congress has given up on new fuel economy standards and begun to starve clean energy of funds. The country largely stumbles through the 1980s and 90s with the occasional electricity crisis or Middle Eastern war, but for the most part, we largely coast. But over the last dozen years, energy has reemerged and become central to some of this country's biggest debates. Just like in the 1970s, the transformation begins with events in the world. The September 11th attacks lead people to reconnect energy and national security. The emergence of China leads to fears of rising prices and increasing scarcity. Hurricane Katrina dramatizes the risks of climate change. And that's followed a few years later by skyrocketing gasoline prices that make energy a pocketbook issue once again. The second thing that happens has echoes of the 1970s too. Driven by markets and policy, American energy begins to transform in a way that we haven't seen for 40 years. A lot of you know the basic trends, but let me recap them for a moment. Natural gas, propelled by fracking, passes coal as the top domestic source of US energy in 2011. Last year, we see oil production rise by the largest one-year amount in history, capping off a 4-year run of increasing production. Over that same 4-year period, renewable energy from wind and solar doubles, while prices, particularly for solar, fall. And US oil consumption peaks in 2005, driven in part by a weak economy, but also by less driving and by improving technologies for cars and trucks. But the echoes of the 1970s don't end with changes in the world or changes in energy. We're also starting to relive some of the paralyzing battles of the 1970s too. You don't need to go that far back to see a time when we could agree, at least in places, on energy. We had bipartisan energy legislation in 2005 and 2007. In 2008, John McCain and Barack Obama fought over whose cap-and-trade program was better. In 2010, President Obama moved against the interests of some of his allies to expand leasing in order to increase production of offshore oil and gas. Now, you don't hear much about these sorts of things today. Instead, you hear about how the Keystone XL pipeline will be game over for the planet, or how blocking it would be a body blow to national security. You hear about how fracking will poison our water and corrupt our politics, or about how it will create millions of jobs, slash emissions, and provide a replacement for oil. You hear about how government support for clean energy innovation will propel the United States to global leadership in the 21st century, or how profligate government spending on losers like Solyndra and Fisker show how badly Washington is adrift. Now, this is a hugely frustrating state of affairs. Here you have, in a span of barely 5 years, changes in American energy that are more radical than at any time in almost half a century, in ways that have big consequences for everything from the future of our economy to the health of our environment to our position in the world. And instead of using this as an opportunity to rethink how we approach energy and take advantage of the changes that are underway, we're mostly grasping at old ways of thinking and settling back into stale and destructive debates over what to do. It's that mixed sense of opportunity and increasing frustration, together, to be quite honest, with great fascination about what's happening and its consequences that motivated me to write this book. I tried to do three things with the book.